Hello, this is Fishy Swa. Welcome to viewers, and hope you enjoyed today's video. While these game highlights are going on, I'm going to talk about something that I like a great deal. I'm really actually interested in magic theory, whether that be theory of gameplay or theory of deck construction. But now today I want to expand our discussions of magic theory and talk about something from industrial process control, something called theory of constraints. I'm going to try to cover theory of constraints in several parts so that you leave with some knowledge of what theory of constraints is, where we might apply it, both in gameplay and in deck construction, and what its basic steps are, at least some of the things you might try. So, here we've got a couple games going on. In terms of the games, I've got 3 different decks. I'm just trying out and goofing around. Nothing special or groundbreaking here. First up we got a Wizards deck, second we've got a Kicker deck, and third we've got a Cleric deck. Welcome to Zendikar. So, theory of constraints is from industrial process control. And here I'm looking at industrial process control because many things in Magic are processes. We've got the process of casting spells. We've got this Bones Crusher Giant casting twice even. We've got the processes of combat between clericers, attackers, and blockers, and all the various effects you have in there. We've got processes, the repeating process of the turns, and ultimately the game itself is a process of processes. And the bigger scale, we've got processes like a tournament, which is the repetition of gameplay with preparatory process, let me say, of deck construction and selection. So there are several places where we might try to control our processes to get more out of them, to get higher impacts for the same costs that we're going to be paying. Because let's be honest, we're going to be paying costs over the course of the turns, and those costs are probably going to be pretty fixed. So, and theory of constraints is focused on that kind of process control, getting more out of what you're already doing. It was originally developed by Dr. Eliyahu Goldratt. In particular, theory of constraints, it focuses on the system and the system throughput. And that throughput is defined largely by the throughput through the constraint. So let's talk a little about process of theory of constraints itself. Theory of constraints comes down is typically, theory of constraints is put forward with the 5 focusing steps. Those steps are identify, exploit, subordinate, elevate, and repeat. Identifying a constraint can be quite simple. If you're completely lost with a constraint, you may even just nominate something, choose something to be the constraint, follow the process, and as you execute the process, other constraints will move to the front and cause you to switch to them and improve those constraints. Or you could, if you have a clear process, choose to focus on where the work is building up ahead of time. What needs to get done. If you have excess mana unspent, that may be your constraint. If you see you have cards and not the mana to execute your plan, you have a different constraint. Sometimes you run out of attackers. Sometimes you get punished for putting too much on the board. And sometimes you get punished for not being able to pressure your opponent out of the game. So, look at what happens in the game. Choose a constraint. generally speaking, when I'm looking at deck construction and deck refinement, I'll repeatedly play a few games with the deck, generally going for 3 losses, because sometime in the time it takes you to get 3 losses, you will have had the same problem multiple times. And when we're talking about the kinds of things, the kinds of sample sizes we're looking at there, the same event happening twice detrimentally in that small number of games is the kind of event you want to focus on and eliminate. So now that we've talked about how we want to eliminate that kind of, identify that kind of constraint, let's talk about exploiting that kind of constraint. In industrial process control, the identification of a constraint, the exploitation of a constraint is frequently done with one of 2 things. You can either write a schedule for the constraint to make sure that you're always utilizing it, because that is one of the biggest reductions to throughput is that since the throughput of the system is dependent on the throughput of the constraint, not using all the throughput of the constraint is going to be a major failure of the system. A second approach to exploiting is to measure what is in industry called inventory days late. So this is the cost of your inventory multiplied by how many days it sits at any given process. And for different stages of your process, you have different goals of this metric. Generally, it's to reduce it, but at the constraint, it's also to increase the value of things passing through the constraint, so that you get the most, again, out of your constraint. For the second step, subordinate. Here I want to bring up John Finkel's maxim of focus on what matters. All of this, in some way, is just a way of focusing on what matters. Subordinating to the constraint is something you do with the rest of your processes, and it is the way you use those processes to protect your constraint, to make sure that it is not affected by the shocks of the processes going on around it, so that it has what it requires, and that it is not inoperable due to what's going on around it. This is also the step where you will identify and stop doing those things that don't matter. It is very important that you stop doing those things that don't matter. Only once we've made sure that our constraint is being utilized to its utmost and protected, only then can we move on to elevating our constraint. Elevating the constraint is actually the process most people think to address first when dealing with constraints. It is acquiring more capability in the constraint. Elevating the constraint is not done first in theory constraints, because elevating an unprotected, underutilized constraint is not going to elevate your throughput in proportion with the investment that you have to make to elevate it. And elevating the constraint basically always requires some kind of additional investment. Finally, the final step of the theory of constraints process is to repeat. And here we repeat not just because we repeat primarily because having addressed our constraint like this, we will find in all likelihood that the constraint is no longer constraining. We are getting so much out of the constraint that some other part of the process is constraining. As we approach this, we move the constraint actively. In a Magic game, the ideal place for a constraint is in your opponent's deck. You want your opponent not to be able to respond to you and not to be able to get anything done. In second best place would be to be in your opponent's play. That your play is such that your failures, you will not be making failures, and your deck is strong enough to respond to their deck, and therefore when they make a mistake, then your deck is there to capitalize it and push your advantage to victory. Generally, we find with first trial decks, like these ones I'm showing you, the deck we are building is not yet strong enough to not have the constraint within it. When the constraint is not within ourselves or our decks or our processes, but in the environment around us, we still can apply theory of constraints. Our applications and solutions must be still internal, as that is still the only things we can directly control. But we can control and schedule, we can, for example, schedule to the constraint in the outside world, and we can release new tasks and efforts, new cards, new castings, new attacks, only when the outside world makes it clear that that's what should be happening. So another thing about theory of constraints is, with the changes we make inside of theory of constraints, our competition isn't necessarily seeing the same constraints and acting under the same constraints we are, even if they have the exact same deck list. And because of that, we can move easily and improve ourselves in a way that others cannot copy, which will give us a competitive advantage that they just can't keep up with, put us ahead. So, thank you for listening to all that. Let's, now that I've said that piece, take a look at this. The Bolt Hound attack here is rather big, but the Attendant Healer is a nice answer. All the life gain going on here and tokens have made my opponent quite vulnerable. And you see Thwart the Grave in hand. It will very shortly rebuild my board to a quite fatal extent, even beyond the best my opponent can throw at me, which will occur shortly. Just a little demon friend for us. No big deal. The cats honestly have been a bigger deal in this game. And free attacks. Got the 5/5 here to protect us. And there's our opponent's best. Knew it was coming. Thank you for sitting through this game review. I appreciate your feedback and comments. And I hope you enjoy some theory, and we'll cover some more stuff next time we talk.